Story 1. It started when my mother and her two sisters, Louise and Teresa, were playing around in a cemetery. I know, they were playing in a cemetery. My mother apparently forgot about the age-old, don't walk on the actual graves rule, while they were playing hide and seek and was running from Teresa. She stepped onto a grave and the ground gave way and she fell into the grave. According to her, the grave was from 1907 and bore the same name as hers. They scooped some of the dirt out, took it home, and got out their Ouija board. Jimi Hendrix had just passed away, and her older sister decided she wanted to contact him. They decided that the best way to increase the power of the board was to sprinkle the grave, dirt around the board, light some candles, and turn out the lights. Jimi Hendrix did not answer them, obviously, but a woman named Amy did, and she apparently thoroughly chastised them for being naughty girls. The planchette immediately after moving to goodbye. According to all three women, the room was silent until the wind picked up outside and blew around the outside of the house in such a way that it sounded like a shrieking woman and a moaning man all at the same time. There was no wind in the room, yet the candle flames instantly went out and the lamp on the bedside table switched on by itself. All three girls ran screaming out of the room and hid in their father's bedroom, between the wall and the bed. After they calmed down and no longer felt threatened, they discussed what should be done next. They went back into Louise's bedroom, where they had been performing the seance, brushed the dirt into a linen handkerchief, retrieved the board, retrieved salt and matches from the cupboard in the kitchen, and went outside. In the backyard, they said the Lord's Prayer while holding hands, sprinkled the board and grave dirt with salt, poured gasoline on the items and burned them. They went back inside, feeling like this was over, and tried not to think about it anymore. Nothing happened for a few weeks until the youngest, Louise, began having terrible nightmares, to which she would wake up screaming several times a night. My mother was next, followed by her older sister, Teresa. My grandparents, both very quiet and not the type to tell tall tales, described the upcoming months as nights with no sleep, rushing from one room to another, flicking lights on and off, falling into bed after soothing one daughter, drifting into sleep, only to be awakened by another screaming girl. This went on for several months and then stopped abruptly. Just as my grandparents were beginning to feel well rested, Louise began screaming for her mother and father in the night again. "There are people in my room." According to Louise, she would wake up because she could hear people talking, and when she would open her eyes, the bedroom lights would be on and there would be a man and a woman standing in the corner of her bedroom, sipping cocktails and having discussions about the weather. My grandmother started sleeping in bed with her now 16-year-old daughter. For the first few days, nothing happened. Then my aunt poked her awake in the middle of the night. Grandma opened her eyes and looked around the room, seeing nothing, hearing no noises, and when she began to ask Louise why she woke her up, Louise grabbed a fistful of her nightgown and said, "Shh." And then the lamp on the bedside table turned itself on. My grandmother jumped out of bed, grabbed Louise by the arm and dragged her into my grandpa's bedroom. She woke him up, told him what happened, and they both slept in his bed for the next several weeks until Teresa, now 18 and going off to college, moved out, at which time they moved Louise into Teresa's old bedroom. More things happened over the years, but it slowly tapered off into an every-once-in-a-while thing once they moved Louise into another bedroom. Now, 47 years later, that bedroom is like a time capsule. My grandmother used to clean it weekly, but they never moved anything out of it except Louise's clothing. All the furnishings have stayed the same, and after years of refurbishing every other room in the house, that room still has pea green shag carpeting and orange and gold owl wallpaper. Since Grandma died 10 years ago, no one has really bothered with the room, except for the occasional cleaning it gets when there's one too many extra overnight guests and someone has to sleep in there. And no one ever makes it all night. We almost always wake up to find this person sleeping on the couch. At night, when no one is in the room, you can hear people talking, a lot of people. Like there's some kind of party going on in there coming from that room. As a child, that room was the source of nightmares. All the older cousins would play tricks on the younger ones to force them into that room, only to lock them in. I myself was locked in the closet when I was 7, but that's a whole another story. Until their cries for help attract adult attention, or even just the standard, "You're too little to play with us." You have to stay in the back bedroom for 5 minutes alone if you want to play. There have been small bouts of activity throughout the home over the years, but It's really just something that everyone is used to. And for the last 35 years or so, that room has just kind of belonged to them. Growing up, spending summers at my grandparents' house, you could always hear what sounded like a party going on in the back bedroom at night after my grandfather had gone to bed. You could never really understand what they were saying, though, and the closer you would get to the bedroom, the quieter they seemed. My older cousin actually locked me in the closet in that room when I was about 5. I say locked, but all she really did was close the door. I don't remember why I couldn't get out of the closet, but I remember trying to open the door and not being able to. I didn't want to yell for help because, A, that would make me a chicken, and she wouldn't want to play with me anymore, and B, it would get her in trouble and she wouldn't want to play anymore. So I sat on the floor of the closet with my back to the wall. It was quiet for a moment, and I heard footsteps outside the door, so I thought she was finally going to let me out. But she didn't. According to her and everyone else in the house, she had gone outside to ride her bike. I heard the wire coat hangers start moving back and forth across the rail on their own, scraping back and forth, and then an old doll fell off the top shelf and landed in front of me. It was the kind that had the little sound box inside it, and when it landed at me, I looked into its little plastic face and it said, "Mama." I started screaming bloody murder and pounding on the door, and my grandfather came to the rescue. I remember hearing him run down the hallway and seeing him sling the door open. It was really traumatic for me, but probably not as traumatic for my cousin. He made her sleep in that room by herself that night as punishment. She has pretty much hated my guts ever since. TLDR, my mother and her idiot sisters used grave dust and an Ouija board to conjure some kind of vengeful spirit named Amy, who made their lives a living hell throughout their teen years and who is still messing with them 47 years later. Story 2. I was born and raised in the South. Rural Georgia, to be specific, less than an hour from Savannah. It is a spiritual region. You grow up with Baptists, you learn that there are some otherworldly forces out there that can protect you or mean you real harm. An example of the former, when I was really young, we had a tornado come through in the middle of the night. Me and my little sister slept through the whole thing on the couch with our new puppy, Guinevere. The following morning, it was pure devastation everywhere, trees down, lines down. A fallen trunk had crushed my aunt's car clean in half, but there wasn't a scratch on our little trailer. It was like a barrier had been placed around us, like some benevolent force had raised a hand and stayed destruction from us so thoroughly, the raging storm never even woke us up. Now, for an example of the latter. My mother is one of those empaths things. She doesn't necessarily see dead folks, but she can feel when that spiritual pressure begins to build. For years when I was young, she would be bedridden all the time with migraines and immense headaches. She and my dad didn't tell me why. Why would they? But they believed there was a lot of energy coursing through that backwoods area. I told them once that the hall window made me nervous at night. The next day, my dad had a NASCAR flag pinned over it. It wasn't until years later that they told me about the thing that had it out for us. Looking back, I understand it now. Some of those bad entities, they can tell when you can sense them. The one on our land knew my mom could tell where it was. Lurking at the edge of the yard, the hall window at night, and it didn't like that very much. It would target my mom specifically. It was part of why her head hurt all the time. It would take her paper plate out of the trash can in the closet at night and leave it on the counter for Dad to find. That kind of thing. One night, my dad encountered it for himself. He woke up in the middle of the night and was having a smoke in the kitchen when he noticed something through the window. He stepped out onto the front porch and there it was, a black shape just sitting on the edge of our trampoline a few yards beyond the reach of the porch light. He told it, firmly, to beat it, leave, stop messing with his wife and kids and leave us alone. It responded by rearing up at him and making a snorting sound, challenging him as if to say, "And what's you do if I don't?" My dad bolted back inside. I moved here to Alabama when I was 13. That place is a distant memory now. But my experiences didn't stop there. Since 2012, I've been an off-and-on volunteer at the local museum complex, 2 of them, one natural history, and the other a world history museum full of antique weaponry, founded by a married couple of old WHI spies. My experiences are from this museum. There are thousands of items in the collection. Only 13% of it is on display at any time. The rest is in the basement. My mother, now the registrar at these museums, has her office down there, right beneath a massive shelf loaded with antique bronzes, staring down at her. Joy. Now, I said the museum was founded by WI spies. As such, it is overwhelmingly interesting and/or clandestine antique weaponry. Many of these weapons have tasted blood before. It stands to reason energies or spirits are attached to any number of them. We have no way of knowing. However, several entities live in the basement where my mom works. They have different personalities. One is a casual observer, who lives inside a giant wooden Buddhist statue, the kind with the square hole in the side to insert prayers. Bodhisattva Guanyin, pronounced like that. Another is a joker who likes to move things. Once, me, my mom, my sister, and one other volunteer were taking inventory. We had the huge wall vault of weapons open, moving items in and out. My sister goes to put a crossbow back in a corner of the vault. When she turned around, an old can of survival water that had been in this corner had moved. It was then on the floor, in the middle of the aisle, behind her, with the label facing directly at her. She thought one of us had done it as a joke. We three were all the way over at my mom's desk. Lastly, there's the mean one. He doesn't like you, he doesn't like anyone. He is a being of invisible, concentrated hate and malice. My mom calls him Big Nasty. He will push over dangerous weapons near you, or more commonly, he will rush you. You won't see anything, but you'll be able to feel a dark, evil freight train of rage barrel from the far end of the basement, right up to you and just stop, towering over you and seething with contempt. He likes to do that when you're turning the lights off. Real charmer, that bastard. Then there's the stuff you do see. Once, I was coming down the stairwell to the basement door. It's the same kind of double door you see in schools, metal, with a rectangular window reinforced with the crisscross and wires. As I stepped onto the final landing at the top of the last flight from the bottom, I turned to face the door. From my position, for a fraction of an instant, I saw someone move away from the window. It was so fast that my brain didn't register hair color, skin color, or clothing. Nothing distinguishable other than a human shape, leaning away from the window. I thought it was my mom peeking while waiting, to startle me as she does that sometimes for funnies. When no one peeked again, I slowly made my way down and pushed the door open. I round the corner and she's at her desk. I fill her in and she just nods. Happens all the time. It's very hard to describe what happens when it happens. You see movement, but there's nothing there. But how can nothing move? It's mind-bending, seeing what you thought was a head of red hair moving between two shelves only to dissolve in midair before your brain even gets its shit together. Then, of course, there's the touching. I should note it isn't confined to the basement. You could be on the second floor in the World War's exhibits and feel someone run a finger up the back of your arm. Other times it's not as mind, and you'll actually get a push. To sum up, I am a very logical person. I believe in science and am very grounded. But I grew up being shielded from dark forces by my Baptist elders and have spent my whole life bathed in superstition and witnessing shit like you wouldn't believe. I believe we live in reality. But I don't think we as beings are fully attuned to what reality is, 100%. I think we only see a narrow vertical slice of the real world. We rub elbows with gods and demons every day without even knowing. Story 3. This happened to me when I was quite young. I've only told a few people about this, and as I got older, I've kind of kept it to myself. I haven't talked about it in years. When I was 9, maybe 10, I got terrified trying to sleep one night. So I ran to my mom's bedroom and told her I couldn't sleep. I stayed with her that night. It must have been a couple of hours later I was awakened by a bright light in her bedroom. My mother did not wake up. I looked over her shoulder and I saw a white figure hovering over her, or right next to her. I do not remember seeing wings, but she appeared to be female and looked exactly like my mother, but years younger in appearance. She had her hands folded and she was smiling down at my mother. She then looked at me and smiled at me. I did not get that feeling of calmness. Instead, I felt terrified. I remember rubbing my eyes really hard and burying myself under my mom because I was scared. I didn't want to look up again, but I needed to know if this was real or if I was imagining this. I slowly peeked up again and she was there. I was scared, frozen. I was too afraid to run out of the room. Plus, I was in the safest spot in the world by my mom. I stayed really close to my mom and tried waking her up. I whispered, for fear of startling it, to please wake up. Wake up. I said something is here. I didn't know how to explain it. My mom just mumbled and kept sleeping. I then closed my eyes real tight and never opened them again the rest of the night. I eventually fell asleep, and when I woke up in the morning, I avoided looking in that direction entirely. I even remember putting my hand over the left side of my face as a shield to avoid looking at that side of the room. I ran out of the room and down the hall. It wasn't until around midday, maybe a few hours later, that I was brave enough to look back down the hall and into my mother's room again. As I brought up the courage to look back at the room, I saw a somewhat large blob of what seemed like gas. I knew then that I did not dream this. There it was, not as a figure but as a gas-like object. I didn't bring this up to anyone, not even my family, for years. When I was about 15, my brother and I were having a conversation, and we brought up our past. I mentioned this to him for the first time. What shocked me was his response. He had seen it too. Story 4. When I was in high school, I had a lot of paranormal experiences at the house my dad lived in at the time. It was really old, built in the early 1800s. There were plenty of times I'd be sitting in the living room and distinctly hear the cabinets opening and closing in the kitchen. It was just me and my dad that lived in the house, and you could clearly see when his bedroom door was shut and he was asleep, but still hear it. Normally, my dad worked 7 to 3, but occasionally worked a PM or overnight shift. One night he was working until 11. I was 17 at the time. Around 8 or so, I was sitting in my room playing Borderlands and think I heard footsteps coming from the living room, which was adjacent to my bedroom, and assumed my dad's home early, go back to playing Borderlands. I keep hearing the steps, so I pause the game and listen, and the footsteps are just slowly pacing back and forth between the living room and the kitchen in a steady rhythm. I laid in bed scared shitless and actually counted the steps. Every time it took 15 paces to the living room, 15 back to the kitchen. Needless to say, I did not sleep that night. Had another situation at my mom's house about 2 years before this. Out of nowhere, my alarm clock would go off at midnight every night. I assumed it was busted and got rid of it. Fast forward 2 years, and my mom got another brand new alarm clock for my room, also when I was 17. Suddenly the alarm goes off at midnight. I thought nothing of it and turned it off. Happened again the next night, and then my sister pointed out the old one I had that did it. So I checked and made sure no alarms were set. Double-checked at 11:56. Sure enough, 4 minutes later my alarm went off. Freaked out, I threw it out. That next night was my dad's night to have me. I had a buddy of mine over, and my dad was working that night. He left for work around 2 a.m., and my friend had brought over an iPod dock to listen to music on. Didn't have the clock set or anything. My friend knew nothing of the last couple of nights, so I knew he wasn't just messing with me. So about 2 minutes after my dad leaves, we hear an alarm clock coming from my room. I went in, and you know how if you just plug in a clock without setting it, the numbers just blink on and off? Well, it was doing that as soon as I picked it up. The clock set itself to 12 FOW, and then just turned off by itself. I don't have an explanation as to why this used to happen, but it sure did make me question some things. Story 5. Front lines, somewhere in Asia, the early 1960s or 70s, not sure. One of my close relatives was in front lines. This was not wartime, but there were some skirmishes and fighting. My relative, along with his buddies, 4 to 5 guys, were in their barracks dot, a garrison camp. I guess they had returned there after being on the front lines or on long patrols. Since this was the first night and they all were tired, they decided to sleep. Some people from another company were missing. They were told, I guess, but they didn't know who. Right around midnight or so, 2 of their buddies who were on the front lines returned from there and woke everyone up. They wanted to party, have some drinks. Now, the only thing that was amiss, as far as I remember, is that they were rather well dressed, probably not in combat uniforms. More like a formal that is worn for ceremonial purposes. I guess someone did ask them, and one of them replied they were going back or something. They partied all night. And when they woke up the next morning, 2 of them were missing. All of them thought that they might have left. So after breakfast, there was an announcement on the radio or something, confirming missing persons or KIA. Their names appeared. My relatives and other PPL rushed to tell me that there might have been some mistakes. so they decided to go to the main office or something. Not only did the people confirm about the two people, their bodies were recovered the previous evening, well before they appeared tip-top in the barracks, seen by at least 4 or 5 people, and drank and had a good time. This is from my recollection. I may have missed some facts. Again, this happened in the early 70s or 80s. One of my family friends, let's call him Bob. This was his nickname name, I think. He returned to his hometown on Christmas Eve or maybe New Year's Eve. There was a party right outside his home. The location was a huge open space. Now the main party was happening close to the home. He kind of moved away and met a girl who was eagerly looking at people from a distance. He, being a gentleman, invited her in. She was happy and smiled and was eager to come and enjoy herself. But it seemed she never went to the main area or crowded section. Anyways, the girl spoke at length about herself, where she lived, where she studied, etc. Bob knew her parents, more like he knew their names or something. Anyway, the girl says goodbye and thanks him, etc. and goes away. She actually, in his words, just disappeared. Like he was getting something for her, and when he came back, she was nowhere to be seen. The next morning, Bob asked his friend about this girl. He pointed out where she stayed. His friend was a bit puzzled and said there was no one with that name. Later on that evening or next day, Bob again inquired about this girl. His friend or someone did see him with a girl on that night, so it was not that Bob was imagining things. Anyway, they go for a walk and they come across this home. Bob recognizes the name and asks his friend whether he knows the people in that home. I guess somehow they went to that home, and Bob asked the parents about the girl. They were puzzled too. The reason? The girl had died like 2-3 years back. However, Bob knew a lot about that girl. Whatever she told him, college, etc., was true. Story 6. This brings memories. Well, when we arrived in Mexico, I was about 11 or 12 years old, went to live with my aunt for a few years. Big, nice, a 2-story, 3-bedroom house. Let's say my aunt got on a few people's bad side, and those people were fans of witchcraft, black magic, all that stuff that try to find logical explanations for once they happen. My aunt and her husband left for a small vacation to Mazatlan, and just me and my 2 cousins were left in the house. One morning we found a black rooster dead outside the house. We didn't think anything of it and just cleaned and got back to business. That night we heard the front door bust open. It was a heavy door with metal frames. You'll probably need some tool to bust that baby open. My female cousin, 12, whom we'll call AC, came crying into my male cousin's 9-room. We'll call him JC. Being the oldest man-child in the house, I took it to myself to check what was going on. So I led a scout down the stairs to see what was going on. If you angle just right from the stairs, you can see straight to the front door, which was intact. Well, the moment I reached the ground floor, all the lights went out, and the kitchen cabinet started shaking, opening and closing, slamming shut. We ran back to JC's room, shut the door, barricading it with what we had. A few dressers, a laundry basket. 2:04, we started hearing someone running up the stairs, scratching the door, going into AC's room. We had pretty thick walls. And hearing how something sniffed the room and tore it apart. The lights came back on. AC was crying her ass off, and JC was paralyzed by fear. The temperature became very chilling. You could taste the tension, and I was so pale. We decided to play Halo 3 to try to drown out the noise. We turned on the TV, which turned off a few times, but after a while it started working. We must have passed out, but when we awoke the next morning, my aunt had already arrived and had people checking the house, moved out, and went to my grandma's, which has a few stories to tell about some good scares, some legend about the house. A few weeks later, I overheard my aunt saying something about a portal in her bedroom that was welcoming something. I think they took a priest to clean the place, and that's about it.
The end. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.